The Goddy Jidenma Foundation, as part of its role in shaping the discourse on the socio-economic development of Nigeria and Africa at large, convened its 6th public lecture in Lagos. It brought together leaders of thought, business leaders, policy experts, scholars, technocrats, and elder statesmen, focusing on the theme governance, insecurity, poverty, and economic development Whither Africa. Professor Joy Ogu, chairperson of the event, and Professor Pat UTOMI, chairman of the Board of Governors of the Foundation, in their respective remarks, believed the lecture was an opportunity to reawaken Nigerians in Africa to the possibilities of development.
For me, Ije is the quintessential virtuous woman found in Proverbs 31, I think. For a woman to be so passionate and committed to the memory of her spouse at this level is something phenomenal, very phenomenal. I've been a widow for 5 years, but I can't imagine the level of her commitment. But it takes two. Her husband stood for values, principles, ideas, and that's what endures in any system. Not the ephemeral things, but the values, the principles, because you build on them as a scaffold. But in most African societies, we don't build scaffolds. We erase the blackboard, and we want to start all over again. We keep starting over and over again. So, and then for architect Jidenma himself, he had values. He imbibed principles. He cherished them. He pursued them passionately and relentlessly. He cultivated enduring values, and his desire was to hand over to succeeding generations what he knows about. And his wife continues with that legacy. 3 elements conspire in the making of every great message. 3 elements conspire in the making of every great message. First is the pulpit. Second is the audience. And third is the truth. Professor Lumumba is going to tell us the truth today, and that's why I believe that these 3 elements are present here today. Thank you.
Why do men cooperate in a way that leads to the advance of the common good of all? And very often, we hear as Africans that our binding philosophy is Ubuntu. I am because we are. Sometimes I wonder if we really live our Africanness. I'm glad that today we'll be able to engage on that subject through the prism to the world of a man who has managed to inspire plenty in many of us as Africans. But I want to urge just one thing. As we listen, please, let's not just be like the typical Nigerian audience that enjoys a good speech. If we could make a commitment to doing something, because change will only come from each and every one of us doing something about the space around us. This is a country that keeps waiting for a Messiah. The Messiah has come already, and the Messiah has empowered us to make it happen ourselves.
The keynote speaker, Professor P.L.O Lumumba, a renowned African scholar, in his presentation highlighted the challenges of the African continent, but identified some areas that must be explored to enable its advancement.
Economic development means value addition. We can only begin to grow economically when we are talking about value addition. What value do we add? You know, in the recent past, Excuse me if I'm paranoid, but paranoia is part of the solution to the African problem. In the recent past, I've seen African heads of state being called to Japan by the Japanese Prime Minister to talk about the place of Africa in Japan's economic agenda. Then I've seen them called to Beijing in China. Then I've seen them called to Dubai in the Arab world. Then I've seen them being called to Sochi in Russia. Then I've seen them being called to Germany last week. What is it that people want from Africa? Why is it that Africa is so attractive? Do people love us so much that there is a competition for us? Yes, they love us so much. Because we are the bees that have the honey. But does the bee know how sweet the honey is? I suspect that we do not. How is it that our young men and women are running out of the continent, but if you travel to any African country today, there are young Chinese between the ages of 20 and 35 coming to Africa. There is not a single country that I know today that will not talk of a road that is built by a Chinese company. If it is not a road, it is a stadium. If it is not one such as that, then you have a Chinese restaurant, which the middle class think is a sign of success. Economic development is what I'm talking about. If I look at Africa today, the world is talking about the fourth industrial revolution. We are talking about robotics. We are talking about artificial intelligence. We are talking about the Internet of Things. We are talking about Facebook. We are talking about Signal. We are talking about Instagram. We are talking about cryptocurrency. We are talking about all these things, but where is my beloved Africa in the scheme of things? Where are we? Do we produce a single mobile phone? No, we don't. Do we run any internet marketing tool? We don't. Jumia was founded here in Nigeria, but by French entrepreneurs with a sprinkling of Nigerians. Half of it is now owned by MTN. So we shop from Jumia. We are told that is Africa because it has an African name. We are losing out. We lost out in the first industrial revolution. We lost out in the second industrial revolution. We lost out in the third industrial revolution. We are losing out in the fourth industrial revolution. So as I said at the beginning, we now humor ourselves by saying that those who built the pyramids were African. So what? It is good to humor ourselves with that history, but I'm talking about food on the table now, not the Sphinx in Giza. Africa will only realize her economic development if she begins to move in the right direction, which is what brings me to the last question of my conversation, Whither Africa? Where is Africa going? And is she going anywhere at all? Yes, she is. You know, when I look at Africa, the colonial powers designed the post-colonial African state to fail. That was the design. That is why here in Nigeria, while the North was being administered separately with the South, on the eve of independence, they were put together in the hope that it would collapse. You have defied it. Nigeria is still alive and well, her trials and tribulations notwithstanding. They did the same in Sudan. Administered separately on the eve of independence, they put it together. Unfortunately, it did not stay for long. In the year 2001, it was split into South Sudan and Sudan. The colonial state was designed to fail. But over 50 years after independence, we have managed to weld our countries together so that we have some kind of diversity. And that is why I can still hear Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere, through the vicissitudes of time, say, we inherited artificial boundaries, but let us not redraw them. Because if we start redrawing those boundaries, which country will not be at conflict with each other? Let us only unite. And that is how I understand where Africa is going now. In the year 2013, African states met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And they were celebrating 50 years after the creation of the Organization of African Unity. And I remember the chair of the OAU then was Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. She wrote an imaginary letter to Kwame Nkrumah, telling Kwame, you are right and we were wrong. 50 years ago you told us to unite. We did not unite. 50 years ago you told us that we should trade as one united country. We did not. 50 years ago you told us that our safety would be guaranteed by our unity and unanimity on the things that affected the continent, but we did not. Today, we have recognized our mistakes and we are saying what the Catholics would say on a confession, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. And having said that, we come up with Africa Agenda 2063. Africa Agenda 2063 is a promise to you, our founding fathers. A promise that if we lost the last 50 years, we'll not lose the next 60 years. And not in so many words, but in effect, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was saying, in the next 50 years, by 2063, Africa will be industrialized. There'll be an equivalent of the Silicon Valley in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa will have anchors in the west of Africa. Nigeria, the sleeping giant, will be alive and awake, and ECOWAS will not be the same again. In Southern Africa, South Africa will have shaken the vestiges of apartheid, and she will be the anchor of SADC. In East Africa, we will have Kenya and Ethiopia as anchors, and Tanzania will also make a contribution. In Central Africa, that country that is bigger than the entire Western Europe, the Democratic Republic of Congo, will no longer be a basket case of the world, but she will be the food basket of Africa. And that power will be generated from the Inga Dam. Down in Namibia, solar power will be harnessed. In the Maghreb, the Arabs will have been persuaded to determine that the Africans are not to be Africans when it is convenient, and Arabs when it is inconvenient. And that therefore Africa will become a continent that we can speak of. Africa Agenda 2063, in my view, are the first baby steps which herald a realization by Africa that Africa can only unite if she speaks with one voice. There are those who are beginning to question whether Africa Agenda 2063 was dead on arrival, and before they could say yes, indeed Africa met in Kigali, Rwanda, and came up with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And I'm happy that under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the Secretariat is already being established in Accra, Ghana. And from the month of June next year, Africa Continental Free Trade Area will begin to operate, and Africans will begin to trade with Africa. And when that begins to happen, it will no longer be necessary for the border between Nigeria and Benin to be closed at Sem. It will not be. It will no longer be necessary to close the border between Nigeria and Ghana. It will no longer be necessary to close the border between Rwanda and Uganda. It will no longer be necessary to close the border between Kenya and Tanzania. It will no longer be necessary to close the border between Zambia and Botswana. It will no longer be necessary to control the border between Lesotho and South Africa and Eswatini and South Africa. Africa will be trading as one. Will these things happen in your lifetime? Perhaps not. So this is not for the faint-hearted. This is not instant coffee solution. Our duty is to do what we must and to run the relay race that like it must be run. You run your leg well and hand over the baton to the next generation. It can be done and it will be done, because if it is not done, Africa will not realize our potential.
Professor Lumumba speaks further on the way forward for African stability and economic growth.
First of all, there must be political unity and there must be unanimity in identification of the areas that are critical. To me, agriculture is foundational. We've got to begin to focus on agriculture and deal with agriculture through innovation and invention so that there is value addition. Because once you feed the population, then you are going to address the primary issue of hunger. The second thing is education. We've got to focus on education and produce young men and women who are innovative and are capable of inventing so that they can provide the human resource for industry. Then we must also go into value addition of our primary resources so that when we add value to our primary resources, we can compete in the world. We must also invest in research and development, because it is through research and development we are going to catch up in the critical areas of the Industrial Revolution so that we can participate in robotics, the artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things. And once we do that, we must also begin to improve intra-African trade. In other words, we must bring down the artificial barriers so that we remove all the tariff and non-tariff barriers. And once we do that, I believe that Africa will begin to move in the right direction in terms of competing in the world.
For Dr. E.J. Jidenma, the founder of the Goddy Jidenma Foundation, the lecture is part of the drive to deepen the conversations on achieving progress in Nigeria and Africa.
When you have problems, it can be very, very overwhelming. We are talking of insecurity, we are talking of impoverishment and so on and so forth. But we need this kind of tulip, we need this kind of motivation, we need this kind of optimism so that we can get the energy to begin to work for ourselves, to begin to look inward, because our solution can only come from ourselves. When we have leaders that are original in their thinking, not just copying others, we have to know what stage we are in development and begin to plant our footsteps that way. Everything is not achieved overnight. It can be phase by phase. So that is what we should begin to look at.
The 6th Goddy Jidenma lecture by Professor Lumumba re-emphasized the need for Africans to be optimistic despite the socio-economic challenges, to develop robust political systems that will ensure equity, fairness, innovation, and ingenuity, the values that late architect Goddy Jidenma aligned to during his sojourn on Earth.